Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie, a senior fellow here at Bruegel, and I am thrilled to be joined today with two longtime Brussels and European journalists, heroes of mine, and now coming on this podcast to talk to you about EU-UK relations after Brexit, and particularly how the EU works with the different parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and England. We have Tony Connolly, the Europe editor of Irish broadcaster RTE. Tony also wrote a great book called Brexit in Ireland, The Dangers, the Opportunities, and the Inside Story of the Irish Response. Tony, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Rebecca.
And we have David Gow, who is no longer in Brussels, but is now in Edinburgh in Scotland, where he chairs the Royal Society of Edinburgh's EU Scotland Initiative. So with that, Tony, can you set the stage for us? We've got elections coming up in the UK. We've got sort of a chance to revisit the whole EU-UK post-Brexit situation. Where do we stand?
Yeah, everybody is expecting Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to win the election. And there's been quiet speculation, I think, in Brussels about what that would mean. And I think already there's a bit of a mismatch between what the Labour Party thinks they can achieve in a new relationship with the European Union and what Brussels believes is available to the new government. I think it's important to remember that Keir Starmer has three red lines going into this election. That is no return to the single market, no return to the EU customs union, and no freedom of movement. But having said that, they are talking about having a closer, warmer relationship with the European Union. But what precisely they can get out of Europe is a more troubling question. There are speculations about an EU-UK veterinary agreement, sanitary and phytosanitary regulations being somehow dissolved or reduced. But that's going to cause problems because of the way the EU regards such veterinary agreements. The bottom line there is you have to sign up to the EU's body of law when it comes to agri-food and food safety and animal health and so on. There are other areas where they could make something of a difference. People are talking about the easing of restrictions on bans coming to tour Europe, UK bans that have run into real problems because of Brexit, because first of all, you need a work visa if you're a musician to tour around different countries. Secondly, every piece of equipment has to have a carnet because Britain's out of the customs union. That's a big body of paperwork. And thirdly, the cabotage rules, which essentially mean that trucks can only make 2 or 3 stops at a time when they travel from the UK to mainland Europe, meaning your tour is going to be a fairly short one. So there are areas where the UK wants to have some easing of restrictions without crossing those red lines. But I think it's going to be challenging. And then finally, I would that in 2025 there is going to be a review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which of course is the big free trade agreement between the UK and the European Union. That's up for review in 2025. But I think the UK's understanding of what a review means isn't quite the same as what the EU understands it to be. The EU, in other words, doesn't think it's a renegotiation. It's just looking back to see how things have gone. Have people been complying with the TCA? Whereas the UK probably would hope that it could be opened up for some compromises, some easement, and some closer trading relations.
So you mentioned the customs union a couple of times. Can you just remind people how that works for Northern Ireland now?
It's pretty complicated. The EU customs union basically is one big customs area. So if you're trading from outside the European Union into Europe, you have one single tariff perimeter. So as long as you pay that tariff and meet the customs requirements, once your goods are inside that outer perimeter, they can move and circulate anywhere within the 27 European countries. Northern Ireland, by virtue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is now called the Windsor Framework, is inside the UK's customs territory, but it's operating the rulebook of the EU's customs union, which is a strange and frightful hybrid situation, which causes some problems, but essentially goods that are coming in to Northern Ireland and staying there are subject to very light checks and controls. Whereas if they're moving south into the Irish Republic and thereby into the single market, they're subject to more checks and controls. But overall, tariffs are not really paid on goods that come in because there is a tariff-free arrangement between the UK and the European Union.
David, how do you see this working out with the election and also, as Tony said, with the TCA renegotiation? I'm imagining that in Scotland there are a lot of hopes for how things could change.
Yes, the plain fact of the matter is that, with one or two exceptions, Brexit and the relations with the EU are playing a very minor, if at all, role in the current general election campaign. And indeed, as a former correspondent, for many years, stretching over several decades, I'm astonished that the mainstream, like the BBC and others, haven't even mentioned the fact that the European elections have just kicked off. The Netherlands is voting today, for example. So that's one thing. The people talking about it, they are the Reform, which is the new vehicle for Nigel Farage, whom you will all recall, of blessed memory, or unblessed memory rather, notorious memory. He is making a big fuss. It hasn't worked and it needs to be toughened up. And of course, the other ones who are doing it are the SNP, the Scottish National Party. So in a sense, the two parties really talking about it are the English Nationalist Party, if you want, which is the Reform, and the Scottish National Party here, which is absolutely, plain simply wants to rejoin as an independent country in the EU and become, if necessary, jump the queue and become the 28th member, if it could. Yeah, highly unlikely. And as I always say on these occasions, not in my lifetime. So I think Tony is right, but there are some kind of fanciful ideas about renegotiating the TCA when the review comes up next year. Not a chance in hell. Realistically, nobody in Brussels is interested. So if anything, it may be a little tweak here and there. I think one of the key things which he didn't mention, I think, is security. I think there may be some movement towards, certainly David Lammy, who is scheduled in the minute to become the next Foreign Secretary. He is been talking up a security pact between the UK and the EU. But I mean, there's no real flesh that be put on that, I would say so far. But basically, the Brexit and Europe are very much kind of second series or players or issues, rather, in this general election campaign. And I think that the Labour, for example, is absolutely insistent that it will not move other than perhaps, as I say, on security. Although, I could add here, there are numerous people standing in the elections who are members of, for example, the Labour Movement for Europe. At least 75 or more out of the 650, maybe 100, are, sign-up supporters of that. So we shall have to see. My own view, and this has emerged very strikingly from the initiative, the work of the RSE initiative, which we've been doing, is that Labour, if it is, and indeed others, whether it be in coalition or on its own, will find it extremely hard to deliver on the social and economic changes it claims it wants to make without a much closer relationship with the EU.
It's so interesting to hear about the perceptions over there because, as you say, there's just such a disconnect. The EU elections, which, as you point out, are happening June 6th to 9th across the 27 member states. Brexit is not a factor in those. The UK elections, Europe is a minor factor in that. There's a disconnect on how people view day-to-day contact. Even then, when we talk about changing the relationship, the first person who came to mind is Nigel Farage, who wants to toughen it, who doesn't want to promote further coordination. What potential, if any, is there for a more productive relationship? You mentioned security. Is either one of you, Tony, maybe expecting something from the European political community this summer? Is that a chance to reset how people work together?
I mean, I think those meetings are always useful for the optics and for atmospherics, and also just, person-to-person contact, because all of that contact is absent, between officials and ministers. Okay, today we're recording this on the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings, and Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has been meeting Emmanuel Macron, the French President, in Normandy. And, that's a relationship which, is what it is. It's relatively warm, but there is no institutional glue there, really. Now, of course, there are several layers of contact arising out of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. There's a parliamentary assembly. There are various joint committees that govern the different elements of the trade relationship and the cooperation relationship. But, I don't really detect any momentum building on this side of the election, certainly. And everyone's waiting to see what Keir Starmer has to say if and when he's elected. I mean, on the security question, yes, of course, European countries are very enthusiastic about having Britain on the European team when it comes to Ukraine because of Britain's outsized role in the security sphere, its intelligence capabilities. I remember an Irish official telling me one time that when the first Russian sanctions happened after the invasion of Crimea, 77% of the names on the sanctions list were courtesy of British intelligence. So that's a relationship which I think the Europeans would like to review or revive. Now, the thing is that in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement negotiations, the Europeans did want Britain to sign up to some formal treaty arrangement, and the UK said no, they didn't want anything like this. Boris Johnson was dead against it. But if you're going to have cooperation between 27 military and defense establishments with the UK, it's kind of going to need to be on a fairly solid logistical and legal footing if you're going to be kind of shifting, logistics and manpower about the place. So I think that's something that there's a lot of aspiration about, but what it looks like on paper is a bitchin'.
You mentioned D-Day, and one of the most compelling images I saw today was that on French television of the British paratroopers reenacting the landing, queuing up to present their passports on the beach.
Exactly, yeah.
Queuing up to present their passports, yeah.
That was extraordinary, yeah.
Yeah, I think that this is in a sense what Brexit means for ordinary people. What it means for ordinary people is queuing for up to 5 hours at St. Pancras station to get on the train to Brussels or Paris. It's the kind of queues on the M26, the motorway which goes down to, or the M20, going down to Dover, Folkestone, to get across the channel or underneath the channel. These are the things which people are really, and they are utterly, utterly pissed off with it. But it doesn't mean, I mean, there is no suggestion with that they want to have a closer relationship with you. Well, I mean, the reality is that the polling would suggest that if you were to hold the 2016 referendum now, the outcome would be different. In other words, they'd vote to stay in, they'd vote to remain. But nobody's pushing for it. It's not really an issue. And I think that, there'll be the kind of we used to talk about the Europe à petit pas. And I think this relationship between the EU and the UK may improve à petit pas, but little more than that, frankly.
When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about day-to-day relations and different regions. Welcome back. David, you're in Scotland. Can you tell folks about how the United Kingdom works within that union? You've got Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England, who all have their own interests, as well as the federal UK system and also London, the city, which as a financial center almost has its own regional sway. How does that work, and how do they coalesce in terms of working across the channel?
Certainly in the kind of early days when Britain or the UK joined the EU, there was a lot of talk about how, representatives of the different regions, or in our case, the nations, the four nations and regions, would be playing parts in ministerial talks and going to Brussels on a regular basis, and so on. So the reality now, certainly ever since Johnson won in 2019, is very, very different. There is, to the best of my knowledge, and this came up very closely, this became very tangible in the talks that we had, under the Chatham House rule, I hasten to add, was that there is very little contact between the Scottish government, for example. I know that the one I know best, and I believe the same goes true of the Welsh, certainly under Mark Drakeford when he was First Minister in Cardiff. There is very little contact, and the Joint Ministerial Committee, for example, which is set up to deal with these issues, hardly meets. There was the whole issue of getting rid of all the different 4,500 or 4,600 EU regulations in one fell swoop, that which actually they rode back on. That caused a kind of terrible kerfuffle up here because the Scots want to more or less remain aligned, would like to remain aligned. So I think that we're going to have to look at whether this is going to happen over the next 10 years or not. I don't know. But people are beginning to look at a different kind of constitutional structure for the UK. Now, it's one which does not involve basically independence, but it does involve greater powers for Holyrood, for the Welsh Senedd, and for the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. So I think there is a talk that there is fairly, notably with Gordon Brown, of course, the former Prime Minister and Chancellor, fairly kind of limited and interesting talk about federalism. But, the trouble with Britain, of course, is that we have this huge elephant in the room, and it's called England. And because something like, of the 67, 68 million people living in the UK, 60 million of them live in England. They're like their mayors. Now, the mayors have been a kind of interesting thing, and there's people putting, giving them executive powers, almost like the French model, with Anne Hidalgo in Paris or elsewhere. But I think that, it's too soon, too early to talk about, as it were, blueprints for a new federal, semi-federal or confederal structure in the UK. But if there were, that would have a direct impact with the relations with the EU.
You make a great point about how hard it is to pin down English national identity as separate from Scottish or Welsh. It tends to either devolve into folk dancing and sheep shearing, or else sometimes people think of skinheads or other fringe movements that have co-opted that term. But a more practical day-to-day English nationalist identity isn't something that's in the forefront of people's minds. And London is the financial center. Tony, what role does that play? Leaving aside the general, big city and everywhere else dynamic of the UK, you've got London trying to re-cement its relationship with the EU now that there's not assured, financial equivalence and passporting and a lot of these things we were used to. It's almost like politically, the city has its own agenda separate from what Westminster is doing.
Yeah, I mean, the city of London was really a big talking point ahead of the Brexit vote, and then in the immediate aftermath. And, a lot of people were on the Brexit side were saying that Europe wouldn't want to dispense with the scale and the liquidity of the city of London, and to distance itself from it. But in the end, there is at least one equivalence relationship between the City of London and the European Union, but it's still not a close relationship. And if Keir Starmer, if he becomes the next Prime Minister, wants to develop that relationship, we're going to be back into this very circular debate about whether the EU would allow a closer relationship without demanding that the city starts to comply with EU financial regulations. And of course, those have been a lot stricter and a lot deeper since the financial crisis of 10 to 12 years ago. I mean, Europe has managed to draw a lot of business out of the City of London to cities like Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt, Dublin as well. The big thing that the EU is preoccupied at the moment with is the capital markets union, which is something I know you, Rebecca, are fairly transfixed by that particular issue. But that's an example of where the City of London does have an advantage in that it has a lot of very liquid markets. The problem in Europe is that there isn't a culture of easy to use retail investment companies or opportunities for ordinary savers and citizens, the way they have it in the US. And again, in trying to develop that at an EU level, you are getting into turf wars where cities like Paris and Frankfurt are clamoring to have a very strict supervisory element to a capital markets union in order to try and keep that infrastructure in those cities and to, because those, if you have a supervisor, then that tends to act as a magnet for companies in that sphere. So, I think rather than trying to cooperate with the UK in this, I think Europe wants to emulate what the UK has been doing on capital markets.
It's really interesting how all these strands overlap because the EU's efforts to build a stronger financial market, of course, is one that doesn't explicitly include London. But to do it well, they will probably want to work with the big banks and the big financial firms that are all very present in London and indeed all over the world. And trying to make sense of that politically, let alone practically and from a regulatory perspective, is going to be an extra challenge. Ireland takes all of this very personally, having a land border with the UK and having been such a central part of just the practicalities of how this is going to work every day. How is this playing over there, Tony?
Well, Brexit has kind of got into the rearview mirror a bit, since the Windsor Framework was agreed, and then you still had about a year before the institutions in Northern Ireland, which were held up by the Democratic Unionist Party, who were opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol, until they finally accepted the new, more flexible arrangements. So, in order to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland de facto stays in the EU single market and customs union, but in order to avoid a hard border on the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they've had to put into place very complicated trading arrangements because so many huge volumes of retail goods go from Great Britain over to Northern Ireland. It's been a huge effort to try and figure out where do those goods end up. Do they stay in Northern Ireland, in which case there's not really a problem, or do they leak south into the proper single market, and then that's a problem. That all seems to be fixed, although the day-to-day working of that is quite complicated, and there are going to be cases where Northern Ireland will have to decide, is it going to stay aligned with EU policy when it comes to, say, food exports, or will it stay aligned with the rest of the UK, where it's, it might have very obviously very important markets. An interesting byproduct of this whole relationship has been on migration. Now, as we know, it's been a huge problem for Rishi Sunak to deal with the boats on the channel, bringing migrants, some genuine refugees, but obviously a lot of economic migrants to the UK. And he's had this signature policy of having them all sent to Rwanda to be either processed or kept there indefinitely. Now, because you can move from Great Britain over to Northern Ireland without any checks and controls as citizens, what's been happening is that you've had people from, say, Afghanistan or places, third countries, who have been in the UK who are worried about this Rwanda deportation potential and who decamp over to Northern Ireland, and then they know they can cross the border because there are no checks and controls at the border and locate themselves in the Irish Republic as a way of avoiding that potential exile to Rwanda. So we've had, according to some estimates produced by the Irish government, tens of thousands of people turning up in Dublin, who are essentially fleeing from Rishi Sunak's Rwanda policy. And that's caused a bit of a diplomatic spat between Ireland and the UK in recent weeks, because Ireland is saying, wait a second, this is this is your problem. We can't clean up your mess when it comes to the movement of these people. We have an agreement dating back to 2020 on returns between Ireland and the UK and vice versa. The UK come back saying, well, we're not going to have an agreement with Ireland if the EU isn't going to give us an agreement on returns, like sending people back to France, for example. So it turned into this very unseemly and quite unexpected diplomatic dispute between Ireland and the UK, although I think they've been quietly trying to resolve it in the background.
That's so interesting.
What has also become very clear is that the attitudes towards immigration, for example, south of the border between here, Scotland and England, are very different from those up here. I mean, Scots like to think they're terribly liberal. You know, they're kind of like company dates, if you want to put it. Well, actually, that's a bad example because the
Danes are cuddly.
Not exactly keen on immigrants at the moment, is it? But anyway, but putting it that way, there is a great need here for immigration. I mean, it's an economic and social imperative because of declining population, because of aging population. There are too many people my age here, far too few young people. And that is, so indeed, and not just the SNP, but quite a lot of policymakers here, this came up in the meetings that I was chairing, that quite a lot of people would like to see a kind of differentiated immigration policy. In other words, more would be allowed here, according to a different set of criteria than maybe would be allowed proportionately, of course, that would be allowed south of the border.
David, you've seen so many changes in how the EU handles free movement. You know, you've seen the borders come down as the EU expanded. You've seen the Schengen changes over the years. Would you have ever thought we'd end up in a situation now where people are worried about specifically foot traffic from the UK into the EU?
No, I didn't. To be honest, no, I didn't. I mean, I think back in 2004, when a lot of countries put on the sort of opted for the transitional arrangements, i.e., transitional controls on free movement from the A8 into the EU, and the UK didn't. Actually, we were all delighted. Many people were quite delighted about that. I mean, I think this is all part of for those of us who started, reporting in Europe. I started reporting in Europe back in 1972-3, when Britain was, vying to join and joining. It's a very different atmosphere. It's not just the size, but I think there's far less hope, there's far less optimism. And I think that I didn't expect, for example, now the people to be reining back on the green commitments. The Green New Deal begins to look a bit shaky. And quite explicitly, since we're in the middle of the elections, I certainly didn't think that parties, of the AfD or the Brothers of Italy or certainly and Le Pen's Rassemblement National, I certainly didn't expect them to be polling around the 30%, 35%. I mean, that is just frankly, to me, people of my age, abhorrent.
So the UK didn't have as many restrictions on movement of people from Central and Eastern Europe as the continent? That is mind-blowing. It just shows how much things have changed just in the last 20 years. Tony, I have to ask you, because it's the number one question I get when I go to the United States. Does this change the odds of a island-wide country or reunification?
It certainly changed the debate on Irish unity, the whole Brexit, paroxysm, if you like, over the past it's nearly 9 years now. And certainly you did start to see fluctuations in polling around a united Ireland. Certainly, if you look at the long-term polling for a united Ireland, it has steadily increased, and also the size of the nationalist stroke Catholic vote in Northern Ireland has steadily increased in proportion to a steady decline on the unionist stroke Protestant vote in Northern Ireland. So you could say that it is trending in the direction of unity. And I suppose the unity question was quite sort of stagnant, moribund for quite a long time, and Brexit has reawakened it because people are saying, look, one way to solve this whole problem of the border and the hybrid nature of Northern Ireland having one foot in one market and another foot in a different market is to have a united Ireland. But of course, the hurdles to united Ireland are still very formidable, and passions are still running very deeply on both sides. But I think what's different now is that, there is a much more pragmatic conversation happening about it. And there are a lot more people in Northern Ireland who do not self-identify themselves as either nationalist or unionist. And those people are essentially saying, I like the status quo as it is, but if you can convince me through economic arguments that a united Ireland would make more sense, then I'm prepared to listen to those arguments. So it's not so much ideological, it's now more practical and pragmatic. And there was a study recently to say that a united Ireland would cost the South about 20 billion a year in matching the commitment that the UK government gives to Northern Ireland for public sector expenditure, salaries, pensions, and so on. And that triggered a reaction, but it wasn't a toxic reaction. It was quite a measured debate about, well, yes, of course, that's a worst case scenario. And if such unification happened, then of course Britain and the EU and the United States would all make sure that there is a financial contribution to help soften the blow and to have a transition. So the Irish government has set up a shared island unit, it's called, and that again is to try and just get people to talk about the implications of unity without it being threatening. Now, of course, any kind of preparations or talk about preparations can be threatening if you're a unionist. And that's why unionists have by and large disregarded that particular body. But I suppose what they're also trying to do is to say, look, there was no preparation in the UK for a leave vote with Brexit, and look at the mess that rendered. So let's make sure we are preparing and discuss all of the implications of what a unity vote might do to the island. What should the flag look like? What should it be, a federal system? Is it that the Irish Republic just gets bigger, or is it a completely brand new country? All of those kind of questions are being looked at by academics, and some of the meetings that have been taking place under this shared island initiative, or there's also another Ireland First or something like that. There's another body looking at this. I can't remember the name of it offhand, but some of the public meetings on this issue have been really well attended in big venues. So at least you can say that a conversation is happening.
If you had to eyeball it, when do you think this might be more of a policy prospect? 10 years, 20 years? Is it possible to even guess?
Let me see. The most recent poll on this was from the European Movement in Ireland. They have a poll every year in association with the Red Sea polling organization. I think this time around it might have been a different organization, but there's still a minority, but a sizable minority of people who think there will be a united Ireland within 10 years, certainly in the south. But I think 20 years people might think it's possibly more likely. But again, it's really hard to say. You've got demographics will play a part. The constitutional nature of the UK will feed into that. The economic situation in the UK will feed into it, as will the economic situation in Ireland and Europe in general.
I think very interesting that, there was a huge, after the SNP, the Yes movement lost the referendum in 2014, there was a huge wave of a pro-independence sentiment.
That would have been the Scottish independence referendum in 2014?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, 2014. And then, and the Brexit referendum gave it even more propulsion. And so did what we call the Slip Commission, which is Lord Smith set up and giving more powers to the Scots. Now, I would say, and so it's just what Tony was saying, I think the general feeling here, certainly amongst the people I talk to, and certainly in the political class insofar as they're talking about it, but certainly amongst kind of public intellectuals or policymakers, if you want to, is that, as I said earlier, Scottish independence is way off the agenda. It's not going to happen for years, 20, 30 years maybe. And what's interesting is that now people think that Irish unity is much more likely to happen within their lifetime than Scottish independence. And that is a change over about, say, the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, and of course, by extension, people would have said that if there was an independence referendum in Scotland which was successful, then that too would increase the likelihood of a united Ireland, because unionists would say, well, what are we in a union with? It's just a kind of a rump, England and Wales without Scotland. And of course, because so much of unionism draws its origin story from Scotland. When you talk about the Ulster plantation, the loss of Scotland would be a huge psychological shock to unionism, I think.
Yes, it would, without a doubt, and precisely for the reason you mentioned, Tony, about the relevance to Scots and so on and so forth. But I mean, I think, who knows? We can all be wrong on this. Nobody suspected that, we would be into the third year, well into the third year now, of a war of a horrendous nature in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing there. I mean, nobody would have thought that. So, I mean, things are now very volatile. Everything is very tumultuous, it seems to me. And so we can't kind of predict this kind of thing with any great certainty, can we? Would you predict the outcome of this weekend's election?
When we come back, we'll talk more about election season and some of the other uncertainties awaiting. As we look at the EU elections, the UK elections, the US elections, the war, there's so much going on right now. Is the hope just that the center holds and we can kind of get through this period and then get on with our lives? Are there any particular risks of things that could go wrong that keep you up at night more than others?
Well, I think for me, it's very much the rise of the far right and whether actually they can... if they're going and what they do, if they get any kind of power, or if they can persuade, for example, in the Parliament, the EPP or others to kind of join with them rather than stick to the tried, and honed coalition, as it were, with the S&D and whatever it's called these days, the Reform, so to speak, Liberals.
Renew Europe is what they're calling it.
Well, they changed their name quite often. Yeah. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, that's the most alarming thing to me. And what that will mean for, for people and for citizens in Europe as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the elections are going to be absolutely central to how Europe is run in the next 5 years, but also we're all keeping a gimlet eye on Washington and the return of Donald Trump. And of course, as David said, you've got a horrendous land war in Ukraine. You've got the Middle East in flames, and all of that is contributing to a really strong, powerful sense of anxiety among voters and a sense that we are historically moving into a different paradigm compared to the one that existed after the end of the Cold War. And it's one that's very hard to predict. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any reverse gear being used at the moment in terms of the escalating rhetoric and the sense of confrontation, both in the Middle East and between Ukraine and Russia and the West. And so that, combined with a big rise in the far right, is a very disorientating and worrying development, because, the truth of them is that in times of real distress and uncertainty, people flock to established parties for reassurance and stability, but that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. They're going in the opposite direction with kind of unforeseen consequences.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that here we are, as I say, in 2024, that in 1945 and afterwards, people talk about that period, from 1945 to 1975 as les 30 glorieuses, that this was the great, huge period of increasing prosperity, countries getting out of bankruptcy and redistribution, of course, of wealth and income. Then we had the kind of the great, the Reaganomics, Thatcheronomics, or whatever you want to call it, and the ushering in of the Washington Consensus. And in a sense, that even that had its kind of benefits, not for me personally, but for others. And now I don't think there's any of that sense at all. I think what Tony just said, we are really entering into a period of another dark period of anxiety. I think that is, we're not entering into it. We're
already there.
Yeah, we're there.
We are still talking the prospective return of Donald Trump. He has not yet gotten to the election, let alone won it. But it is a sobering prospect and not one that fills me with forward-looking optimism should that occur. Washington is such a player in Europe these days. We were talking about the possible use of U.S. funds to help with Irish unity. We're looking at how the U.S. can support the war effort in Ukraine. We're looking at the U.S. role in NATO and in European defense. It seems like a very strange time for Europe to be so politically different from and yet continually linked to and financially tied to the U.S. at this time. I mean, what do you make of it?
Well, I think the war in Ukraine has certainly brought Europe closer to the Biden administration in terms of American security. And, I guess Joe Biden is trying to shore up the Atlantic alliance as much as possible in case Trump gets into power and carries out what he's threatened to do, which is either pull out of NATO or downgrade America's involvement in NATO and downgrade the commitment to European security. At the same time, with the Inflation Reduction Act, America has been, embarked on a somewhat protectionist America First course. And China, of course, has been using its state subsidies and trying to capitalize or hijack Western technology to develop its own sense of strategic autonomy. So Europe is stuck between this particular trifecta of problems with China and with the United States and trying to figure out what direction it should take. And, we've seen that on the question of electric vehicles, the green agenda. There's talk of another next-gen EU massive public subsidy round at EU level. But again, where's that money going to come from? A lot of countries are very indebted at the moment. So it's not a straightforward situation of Europe and America getting closer because of the war in Ukraine. Yes, it has done in terms of the security question, but that could all come apart at the seams if Donald Trump is elected in November.
Yeah, and I think there are very strong industrial and economic interests as well, which are very, very specific and very separate for Europe. They do not coalesce with those of the United States. I recall that in 2019, when eventually von der Leyen was ushered in as a commission president, one of the first speeches she gave was to talk about, the geopolitical European Union. In 2024, assuming she gets re-elected, which is, I gather, is not a given at all, I find it extremely hard to imagine her making a similar type of speech. It's going to be much more defensive, I would have thought.
As we finish this wide-ranging and, for me, really illuminating conversation, any closing thoughts on whether the UK, whether the EU, and will they get there together?
We've got two key elections coming up. The European election will have happened by the time we're on air with this podcast. The big question there is, will the centre hold? I think, according to the polls, there will still be a majority of pro-European parties in the European Parliament. Although it's probably going to be the case that there will have to be a lot of reaching across the aisle on specific policies, looking for soft European conservative and reformist MEPs that the centre might need to pursue green policies, migration, energy policies, and so on. And then, of course, the question is,
if there is a bigger presence of the far right and the hard right in the European Parliament, would that make any difference to relations with the UK? That's, I suppose, an interesting question that we didn't really get into, but that's something that can't be discounted at this stage. And then, of course, if Keir Starmer comes on the 4th of July, which everyone expects he will, then how bold is he going to be in trying to reset relations with the European Union, and how far might he want to go in terms of not just warmer relations, but actually negotiating like add-ons to the TCA, such as a veterinary agreement?
I quite agree. I wholly agree with that scenario, especially because, if you look at the polls over the last few days, I mean, there's been possibly wild, I don't know, fantasy, who knows, but maybe not, talk of a Labour majority in the 300s. I mean, colossal, an absolutely gigantic Labour majority. And the Tories declining, cabinet ministers losing their seats, Portillo moments galore, all that kind of stuff. And Farage doing extremely well. Some Tories are even talking about him overtaking his party in Reform, overtaking the Tories by this weekend. Those you will be reading next week. Who knows? And if Labour gets a majority of 300 or whatever, I mean, I think that's a bit practical. But if they get a stonking great majority, surely it will give them a bit more courage than they certainly have been showing so far.
Thank you, David Gell from the Royal Society of Edinburgh's EU Scotland Initiative. Thank you, Tony Connolly, Europe editor for RTE Irish Broadcaster. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. You can find this podcast and all of our related publications at bruegel.org and The Sound of Economics on all your podcast channels. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.